Hey, it's Minute Book Reports, and I just finished reading The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert. I finished reading chapters 19 through the end, and I just want to share some of my comments and sort of the things that I liked and some of the things that I would have hoped would have happened in the second half of this book. So one of the things that I noted in my previous video was that the writing style in certain parts of this story were very good, and oftentimes those were the parts where we have some sort of narrative, some sort of fairy tale being told, or a blog post, or just something where there's an actual story structure. Those parts were very well written. The thing was, the story style, the narrator with Alice's voice, which is the main voice in this story, it didn't change. It didn't improve like I was hoping it would, and in fact I would say it got more confusing and more tangled. And throughout the second half of the story, it felt like I was trying to untangle this mess that was made even before I read the first half of the story. It was like I jumped into this story and it was very, very tangled. The narrative is not even clear as to the series of events that happened, and I'd like to think that I'm a pretty observant reader, but I think the story could have been improved if there was more dialogue. And I sort of want to explain how and why that's important. I feel like dialogue is one of the most important elements in any story. And this is why I feel like Shakespeare plays, although they're very confusing because the language can be it makes it unapproachable. At least there's a lot of dialogue and you get to know the characters. And if you just stick with it, you're able to understand what the story is about. In this story, we have a lot of narration from Alice's perspective in her mind. And sometimes it's difficult to navigate when we're in the present, when we're in a dream sequence. We can't always trust Alice's perspective because sometimes she shifts so much. So there's this scene where she enters the Hazelwood, which is the grandmother's sort of estate. And as she enters that, she's sort of absorbing all these different things, which is good. We want that description. But during that entire time, she is experiencing these sort of ghosts and these past memories, these dances, and even her grandmother. But there's no talking. There is talking when she's, Alice and the grandmother are sort of addressing each other. There's no talking to get to know anyone. And I feel like the lack of dialogue in this story, it sort of creates a half picture of Alice's character. And I think we use dialogue to get to know characters. Because if you think about it, as you read the dialogue of a character in your mind, as you're reading those words, you are then speaking the voice and the style and those nuances that character is saying, and all the characters for that matter. But you are speaking their words, and in a way they're speaking into you, and you make this connection, and so you understand those characters better. You understand their motives, their personality, and you gain a better understanding rather than the narrator just sort of telling you, oh yeah, they have an anger issue, they struggle with loneliness or depression. If you have a character who is able to speak and express that through words, and as readers we're able to then understand that, then we can pick that up as readers. But with this story, there is a severe lack of dialogue, and I would have wished that there was more talking. Basically, more talking, because the more talking there is, the better we can understand what's going on. We can better understand Alice's motives, which I still feel like, having finished the book, it's very unclear. She wants to rescue her mother, but again, like I pointed out in my previous video, I ask why. The relationship between the two, the mother and the daughter, it doesn't seem that close. And maybe it's because of a lack of dialogue, of conversations between them, rather than just being sort of explained that they were on the road together and that they're best friends. It would have been nice for them to actually have more conversation. And that's why I think it's so important to include dialogue. If you're a writer or if you're reading, pay close attention to dialogue. One of the recommendations I would say is, if you want to read faster and you want to understand the story, read just the dialogue and you'll probably understand what's going on. This story has a lot of prose. It has a lot of description, and it has a lot of internal thought, which I guess in a way could be considered dialogue. But the problem is it's only from one perspective, and it doesn't change up between different characters. So we sort of get lost in Alice's mind, but we never get to know how she interacts with the world if all we're stuck in is her mind. And really, I don't want to be sort of mind connected with Alice with Alice, because she's not a character that I'm particularly fond of. Actually, by the end of the story, it's a very strange and unusual protagonist. So I would just say that dialogue, I think, could have improved the overall writing style. Again, it's hard because there are parts in this story, in this novel, that are so well written. It's amazing, and I like that level of writing. But then we get into Alice's mind, and it's this untangled mess that I feel like I'm working so hard to just figure out what's going on, that sometimes it can be distracting from the story. I also want to comment on pacing and how important pacing is in a novel. If you read The Hazelwood, the pacing seems to be just a step or two off. I feel like we enter the story way too late because we're sort of caught up on the mother-daughter road trip series where they're traveling all over the place, and we're just told that. So I feel like we've already missed good opportunities to get to understand Ella and Alice and their close bond and relationship. But then in the second half of the story, to me, this is extremely apparent when we are sort of told and revealed that Alice is actually a fairy tale character, and she's being drawn back to Hinterland so she can continue to live out her story, the story that was written out for her. And I thought that that would be a bigger point. And again, I really like this idea of characters who are stuck in a storyline escaping, but it happens too late. You know, I feel like if we got to know about that a lot sooner in the story, then Alice could have had more time to process this struggle. And to me, that would have been the appropriate setting to have this internal sort of dialogue going on with her, as well as, you know, conversations with other characters. She might meet other people who are fairy tale, you know, characters, and they're stuck in their storylines, and she's kind of bouncing off ideas on maybe she wants to break out of her storyline. So I like that concept. But I feel like with the pacing of the story, we get hit with that so fast, and she doesn't have enough time to think. She doesn't have enough time to react. And there's this amazing scene in the second half of the story when Alice and the story spinner are walking towards her castle, which is Alice's castle. And basically, they're walking towards her timeline. And I can just imagine if this is going to be a film, that is going to be an amazing walk, because they're having this sort of realization moment, even though, again, there's no real dialogue. Alice is walking and she's seeing all the people around her, and she understands that these are just sort of background characters, and she's the main character in this story. But she hasn't participated in this story for like 17 years. And then she enters that room, and then all of a sudden, boom, her story starts, and she's this baby, and she grows up as a princess, and all, you know, I can just imagine this sort of montage of what's going to happen, and that part is really great. The thing is, I wish that happened earlier. I wish that if Alice was going to be a character in a story, that in and of itself was not necessarily the twist. I mean, I think if you kind of figured out that one of the fairy tale stories was with a character named Alice, and then of course our main character is Alice, chances are pretty good they're either the same person or there's some sort of connection between those two. But I would hope that Alice is really going to be that fairy tale character, and she's going to try to break out of her story, and that's the main plot of this story, rather than trying to find the mother. Then we would know about that sooner, and then that's what the rest of the story could be about, her trying to figure out how to break out of the storyline. There wasn't really a moment where she had time to plan or think about that, because she would pretty much dropped in the storyline, and anytime she tried to resist the storyline, the world would kind of recorrect itself. And again, that's a brilliant mechanic. That is really exciting to think that a character who's trying to break out gets some sort of resistance, and the story tries to correct itself. You know, the story tries to heal any broken parts so that the main character still fulfills their duty in the story. But we never get that. There is just the moment where she decides, okay, I'm going to try and break this. There's a little resistance from the environment, but that's it. She gets rescued, and that's the end. I really would have loved to known what the end of Alice's story would have concluded. They don't really share that, and to me, that's okay. But it would have been nice to know what her fate would have been, because that would have been the what's at stake. That would have been what she's trying to escape, because her storyline is basically she grows up as a princess. She is going to get married. She puts out this challenge for her suitors to bring back ice. Some of them don't do it. Some of them don't successfully do it, so they're killed off. But these two brothers figure out how they're going to do that, and they take her and decide that they want her, instead of a wife, they want her to be their maid, basically their housewife, to do all their cleaning, to be a worker, and that's her future. But we don't really know what that turned out to be up to a certain point, because the narrative stops, and that was in the first half of the book when Finch was trying to explain what was going to happen. I guess all that to be said, the pacing of this story, in areas it could have been drawn out, in other areas I don't think it was that important. And again, a lot of it is lost in the tangleness of Alice's mind. And trying to figure out where we are, what she's thinking, what she's feeling. And again, I think a lot of that would have been helped if it was with dialogue. So those are my thoughts on The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert. It was an interesting read. I finished it fairly quickly, and the book is a quick read. There are some parts I would say that are challenging, but the concepts, some of them are I think great. I didn't really get a lot of things correct in my prediction or my preview video on this book, but the fairy tales that are a part of this world are excellent, and those stories, and when those stories are told, those are the parts that I really appreciate and I really like. So I would love to read a collection of these fairy tales through the Tales of the Hinterland. I would love to read that collection of books, but this book, I feel like, with all the comments that I mentioned, all the things that I think would make the book better, make the story better, it became a challenging sort of read. So those are my thoughts. I hope you liked this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.